Chapter 15 Civic Duty. Hell, I'd have shot Danny Hansford too, said Dr. James C. Metz, the coroner of Chatham County. This guy was just a badass. He scared Williams to death. You know, hell, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and here he is having a temper tantrum because Williams won't play an Atari game. Dr. Metz, a generally soft-spoken man, had spent several hours investigating the scene at Mercer House the night of the shooting. It was he who had signed the death certificate and ordered the autopsy. A week before Jim Williams' trial was to begin, one of Williams' lawyers, John Wright Jones, paid a call on Dr. Metz in his office to discuss the case. John Wright Jones was one of Savannah's better-known criminal lawyers. A burly bear of a man, he was assisting in Williams' defence. He had seen the autopsy report and the police photographs taken in Mercer House after the shooting. He was concerned about the bullet hole in Danny Hansford's back and the one behind his ear. He asked Dr. Metz if it was possible to reconstruct the shooting in a way that Danny Hansford was not lying face down when the two shots hit him. Yes, said Dr. Metz, you could do that. The first shot hit him in the left front side of the chest. When you get shot in the chest, it's like a punch. You rotate, you spin around. So the next shot hits you in the right side of the back, and you keep rotating. So the next shot hits you in the right side of the back, and you keep rotating, and the next one hits you behind the ear. It's possible, if the ballistics work out, that Danny Hansford was not shot lying down. He could have been standing up. That's what I was hoping, said Jones. So the bottom line is you really don't know whether he was shot when he was lying on the floor, do you? That's correct. All right, and if you're called to testify, that's what you're going to say? Yes, said Dr. Metz. But John, you got another problem. The hand lying on top of the gun has blood all over it, and there's no blood on the gun itself. Now, there are only two places where blood was flowing from Danny Hansford, his head and his chest. The boy, when he fell, must have fallen on his right hand. And I guess maybe for artistic license, Williams might have moved the hand out and put it over the gun where, it looked better. You sure about that? Positive. You see, the blood on Danny Hansford's hand is smeared, like somebody dragged it out from under the body. If I was you, I would say Williams panicked and checked Danny Hansford's pulse, reached in there and pulled his arm out and checked his pulse and then put it on the gun so it would look better or something. Dr. Metz's suggestion was not an acceptable opinion. Jim Williams had already put his version of the story on record with his interview in the Georgia Gazette. In the interview, Williams had made no mention of ever touching the body. Damn if you don't brighten up my day, said Jones. Then there's one other thing, said Dr. Metz. Something else that shows Mr. Williams rearranged the scene. He moved furniture to make things look a little bit better, I guess, but he got a little careless in doing it. In what way? He picked up a chair and put it down on top of the guy's breeches leg. Dr. Metz chuckled. Ooh, I bet you got pictures of that, ain't you? Color prints, said the coroner. It shows the pants leg under the chair. Uh-huh. Well, that sure is nice. Jones shook his head ruefully. What else you got? I tell you what, said Dr. Metz. I believe I know when that bastard got shot. When was that? Asked Jones. When he stubbed out his cigarette. His what? I found a cigarette butt that had been stubbed out into the leather desktop. It was still sitting on its end. I think when the guy did that, Mr. Williams got right pissed off and shot him. Like I said, Doc, you really brighten up my day, said Jones. Quite frankly, though, my sympathies lie with Mr. Williams, said Dr. Metz. It did occur around 3 in the morning. Mr. Williams presumably had to get up and work, and this kid was being an obnoxious bastard, wanting to play games and bust up the furniture. Any other words of encouragement? Jones asked. Not that I can think of, John, he said. You got your work cut out for you, though. I would think your jury selection is going to be key. You have a problem there in that it was obviously a homosexual type situation. You'll have to play it so the jury is sympathetic to Mr. Williams and don't think too bad of him for shooting this guy. Jones picked up his briefcase. Well, as we all know, Doc, juries in Savannah don't seem to mind seeing homosexuals get killed. I mean, you can stomp a homosexual to death in our community, and it doesn't seem to make a difference. No, I know, said Dr. Metz. He walked Jones to the door of his office. Well, John, all I can say is Mr. Williams probably did his civic duty shooting this son of a bitch. John Wright Jones's remark about stomping homosexuals to death was a reference to a murder case that had come to trial only a few months earlier and deeply shocked Savannah. The murder victim in that case had been a 33-year-old man from Columbus, Georgia, who had come to Savannah to judge a beauty pageant. Married and with 2 children, he was stomped to death in a darkened parking garage by 4 U.S. Army Rangers. Rangers were reputed to be the toughest men in the Army. There was a squadron of them out at Hunter Army Airfield on the south side. They were trained to endure harsh punishment and to dish it out as well. Early on in the evening of the stomping, a witness saw the 4 Rangers strolling on Bay Street, bending parking meters to the ground with their bare hands. Later, the 4 went into Missy's Adult Boutique, a pornographic bookshop off Johnson Square, where they had encountered the beauty pageant judge. The man made a sexual advance. They enticed him into a parking garage and beat and kicked him so brutally that an expert in trauma injury testified that when the victim arrived at the hospital, he was probably the most mutilated person I have ever seen still alive. He had suffered multiple fractures of the skull, cheeks, jawbone and eye sockets. The expert said it had taken 2 people to pry his eyes open. He was almost unrecognizable as a human being. At the trial, the attorney for the Rangers asked the jury to place responsibility where it lies. The defendants, he said, were young, foolish, clean-cut and honest. They had been the victims of a homosexual advance. The jurors were still sympathetic to the Rangers and rejected the charge of murder. Still, each man had admitted kicking the victim, so the jurors felt compelled to declare them guilty of something. They chose the lightest possible count, simple battery. Simple battery is a misdemeanor. It can mean that one person merely touched another. The sentence was 1 year in jail, with the possibility of parole in 6 months. The Ranger verdict provoked a bitter public outcry. Letters to the newspaper condemned the jury for its callousness and for sullying the name of justice in Savannah. One of the nurses who had treated the victim wrote, "If this is a misdemeanor, may I never see the victim of a felony." The trial had the courtroom debut of Chatham County's new district attorney, 37-year-old Spencer Lawton Jr. The verdict had been a crushing defeat, and it left observers wondering whether Lawton was capable of discharging the responsibilities of his new office. The Lawtons were a distinguished old Savannah family. Spencer Lawton's great-great-grandfather, General Alexander R. Lawton, had been in charge of defending Savannah during the early part of the Civil War, and later became Quartermaster General of the Confederate Army. After the war, General Lawton was one of the 10 men who founded the American Bar Association. He served as its president in 1882. Later, Grover Cleveland appointed him as ambassador to Austria. The Lawton family plot at Bonaventure Cemetery was one of the largest. A white marble figure of Christ stood by a towering Gothic arch on a bluff by the river. Another of Lawton's forebears, Spencer Shotter, amassed a fortune in the naval stores business at the turn of the century and built one of the most grandiose estates in the South, on the grounds of Greenwich Plantation, immediately adjacent to Bonaventure Cemetery. Shotter hired the renowned architectural firm of Carrere and Hastings, designers of the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue, to build the house. It had 40 rooms and a double colonnade of gleaming white marble columns that wrapped around all four sides. There were 12 master bedrooms, 10 baths, a ballroom decorated in gold leaf, a dairy farm, a covered swimming pool, and magnificently landscaped grounds. Palm trees were imported from the Holy Land, a weeping willow from Napoleon's tomb on St. Helena, and statues from the ruins of Pompeii. The estate was the setting of exquisite balls and yachting parties. Movie scenes starring Mary Pickford and Francis X. Bushman were filmed there. By the time Spencer Lawton came along, however, the grandeur of the Lawton family had all but vanished. The Shotter mansion had been destroyed in a fire in the 20s, and the grounds had become an extension of Bonaventure Cemetery, known as Greenwich Cemetery. The Shotter mansion had been destroyed by a fire in the 20s, and the grounds had become an extension of Bonaventure Cemetery, known as Greenwich Cemetery. The prestigious law firm of Lawton and Cunningham had been absorbed by another law firm, and the imposing Lawton Memorial Hall on Bull Street had been converted to a Greek Orthodox church. Spencer Lawton was a soft-spoken, mild-mannered man, with gentle blue-grey eyes and dark hair combed in a pompadour. Chubby cheeks and a ribbon bow mouth gave him a cherubic look. He had been, by his own admission, an indifferent student at the University of the Georgia Law School. Afterward, he returned to Savannah to practice law. He did largely pro bono work. A woman who encountered him when he was a hearing officer for the Savannah Housing Authority remembered him as being highly principled. "He was a decent man," she said. "He more than did his job. He showed concern and compassion for the poor, but he was a little timid, as I recall." For the past 30 years, the Chatham County Prosecutor's Office had been the private domain of Joe Ryan. Ryan's son, Andrew Bubsy Ryan, had succeeded his father and served one term when Spencer Lawton decided to run against him. Bubsy Ryan was a good old boy. He liked to go fishing, hunting, and drinking. He had a full head of tousled brown hair, long reddish sideburns, and bags under his eyes that made him look permanently hungover. He got along well with the police. He was good at horse trading and had a folksy, drawling courtroom manner. Bubsy argued every major murder case himself, but it was no secret that his management of the prosecutor's office was casual at best, just as it had been under his father. A backlog of over 1,000 untried cases stretched back 25 years. Bubsy enjoyed being DA, but he admitted it did have its drawbacks. "You're limited in some ways," he said. "You can't go out drinking with your wife, because you'll read about it in the paper the next day." The Ryans were not accustomed to having opposition at election time, but when Bubsy came up for re-election, one of his assistant DAs announced he would challenge him in the Democratic primary. The two began sniping at each other almost immediately, and on the last day of the filing, Spencer Lawton saw an opportunity for himself and made it a three-way race. "I ran for a lark," Lawton said later. While the other two tore into each other, Lawton took the high road and spoke about case management and other sensible-sounding things. He tiptoed through the wreckage of Bubsy and the other man. When Bubsy and Lawton found themselves in a runoff, Bubsy took aim at Lawton. He hooted that Lawton had been a failure as a lawyer, that he had never tried a felony case, never had appellate experience, never argued a case before the Georgia Supreme Court, and that as a direct result of his laziness and incompetence, he had exposed the law firm he had worked for a malpractice suit. 2 days before the election, Bubsy went one step further. He took out a half-page ad in the Savannah Morning News and quoted a statement from a divorce proceeding from Lawton's former wife. Mrs. Lawton said that Spencer had told her many times that he would be happier staying at home and keeping the house and reading than he would be working. The underlying message in the ad was that Spencer Lawton was not the man enough for the job. Bubsy's crowd referred to Lawton as the Pillsbury Doughboy. But then, on the night of the primary, Bubsy Ryan watched in disbelief as the returns from the black precincts went against him and gave the nomination to Lawton. Lawton went on to defeat the Republican candidate in the general election. Doubts about Lawton's ability grew after he took office. Disgruntled staff members, holdovers from Bubsy Ryan's era, passed the word that Lawton did not know the law. "He's asking for memos and on things he should know," one assistant DA complained. "Like extradition. He wanted a memo on insanity defense too, which you could write a book about." Then came the stunning defeat in the Rangers case. As it happened, the Rangers' verdict was handed down a few days after Jim Williams shot Danny Hansford. Lawton drew a bead on the Williams case. It would be a means of redeeming himself if he won, but it would be a difficult fight. To handle his defense, Jim Williams retained Bobby Lee Cook of Somerville, Georgia. Cook was a famous character in criminal courts throughout the South. His specialty was murder. Over a span of 30 years, Cook had defended 250 people accused of murder and got 90% of them off, sometimes against substantial odds. Cook would take the untouchable cases nobody thought could be won, and he would win them. He was famous for his lacerating cross-examinations. "I've seen him take a fellow before lunch," said a federal judge, "examine him a while, comment at lunchtime that he was playing his witness like a bass, and then come back after lunch and finish destroying the man." In an article extolling his technique and his daring, People magazine had once declared that if the devil ever needed a defense, Bobby Lee Cook would take the case. Being from the mountains of North Georgia, Cook knew that a Savannah jury would perceive him as a slick, out-of-town lawyer. Therefore, he wanted a local lawyer to assist him, and filling that position, he selected an attorney most likely to unnerve Spencer Lawton, the lawyer who had just beaten him so badly in the Rangers case, John Wright Jones.